Call this executive committee meeting of the Poverty and Homelessness Board to order. For a quorum today, we need 3 of the 5 members present. We do have a quorum, and I'm going to go around the room for introductions first, and then be prepared online. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, your organization, and just a half of a sentence about anything you want to say. So begin with Andrea.
Sure. I'm Andrea. I use she, her pronouns, outreach and coordinator here at Lane County Human Services.
Hi, Amanda Borda. I'm a senior program services coordinator with Lane County, overseeing our continuum of care.
Hi, I'm James Yule, he, him pronouns. I'm the homelessness and community action manager for Lane County.
And I'm Pat Farr. I'm one of the co-vice chairs of the Poverty and Homelessness Board. I am standing in, or sitting in, as it were, for Sean Murphy, who is absent excused. She had, I don't know if this is a good excuse, her daughter is graduating from college. Where are her priorities?
Matthias Smith, youth representative and vice chair along with Pat Farr.
And go online. And James, do you want to call people by name, or Amanda?
I can, sure. Let's see. Let's start with Diana.
Hi, Diana Aldridge, Human Services Division, she, her, your friendly clerical support.
And Maggie.
Hi, Maggie Bagan, down in Florence. I'm a Lane County Poverty and Homelessness Board member and also a Family Resource Coordinator at Lower Umpqua Hospital and SNAP Outreach for the Florence Farmers Market.
Thanks, Maggie. Amy.
Amy Wilson, Program Services Coordinator for Shelter and Severe Weather Response with Lane County Human Services.
Brianna.
Hi, everyone. Brianna Rogers, she, her pronouns. I'm a Senior Program Services Coordinator with Lane County Housing and Community Action, working with anti-poverty and homelessness prevention programs and your Community Action Board Liaison.
Erin.
Erin Fifield, staff with the City of Springfield.
Jonna.
Hi, I'm Jonna. I work for Full Access. I provide case management services to adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and I use she, they pronouns.
If I may interrupt for a second, Jonna, this is your first meeting. Can you take a moment to just introduce yourself a little bit more in depth?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think this is my second meeting, and I am attending orientation tomorrow, so I'm super excited. And yeah, I'm really excited to work with you all and working with unhoused folks and people in poverty has always been a passion of mine. So I'm really excited to be here.
And I'll speak for the chair to say that we are thrilled to have you here with your depth of experience and your attention to detail, Jonna. Thank you very much.
Moving on, Keely.
Hi, everyone. I'm Keely. I'm the I'm the project director for the ESS operated emergency shelters here in Lane County. And I apologize, I'll be off camera and mostly off audio today because we have landscapers at our center today.
Thank you. Chris.
Chris McAllister, lived experience seat with the honor of serving on this committee for a while. I'm also the executive director of Carry It Forward, which runs two of the all-in projects in Eugene.
You, Lori.
Hi, everybody. Lori Peralt, Catholic Community Services. I'm the executive director.
Lou.
Lou McDonald, she, her programs, operations team for the Human Services Division of Lane County.
Maria.
Hello, Maria Cortez, Senior Program Services Coordinator with Lane County Human Services Division, and I focus on health and housing initiatives.
Melvin.
Yeah, hi, Melvin Niles, MSW student at George Fox University, lived experienced, just an interested citizen here at Eugene, here in Eugene, Oregon. Participating. Thank you.
Thanks, Melvin. Mike Fleck.
Hi there, Mike Fleck, Community Sharing in Cottage Grove.
Sherry.
Hi, my name is Sherry, and I use her, hers pronouns. And I am currently working as a case manager, house navigator at the River Avenue Center here. And I am also a brand new Poverty and Homelessness Board member.
I was going to point that out, Sharon, if you want to take a moment to give yourself a bit more thorough of an introduction. You did a good job already.
Sure. So serving people who currently do not have housing has kind of been a passion of mine for about 10 years. I am on the lived experience seat, which is interesting. And I grew up in poverty, but I've never actually experienced what it feels like to be unhoused. So it's interesting to be in that role, but I'm excited to see what I can bring to that and how I can support this board.
Thank you, Sherry. And once again, on behalf of the chair, we are thrilled to have you on board with the Poverty and Homelessness Board.
Tim Black.
Hi all, Tim Black, St. Vincent de Paul. After 6 years of Egan Warming Center, I'm now in a different role, putting on an old intergovernmental relations advocacy hat, which I've worked with Commissioner Farr and others in the past, and happy to be here, and thanks for your service.
And then Amanda Noble Flannery. I know you introduced yourself briefly at the beginning, but you want to give a longer introduction?
Hi, yeah, my name's Amanda Noble Flannery. My pronouns are she, her. I work for the City of Eugene. I'm the Housing and Homeless Opportunity Section Manager. Today I'm sitting in on behalf of the mayor who sends her regrets for not being here today herself.
And Amanda, I'm going to jump in and thank you for your years of service on the board of Food for Lane County. I think you were there for 4 years at least.
Yeah, 6. Yes,
6
a long
years.
time ago, but thank you so much.
Oh, it was yesterday, honestly.
That's everyone.
And if we missed anyone, can you state your name and your organization? I see nobody else. And an audio check from me. Can you hear my voice loud and clear online? Either that's yes or no. I'm not sure which.
Heard, Commissioner.
Am I too loud?
I can hear you great.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Then we'll move down the agenda. They've got a good agenda. I'll remind you that this meeting typically is the Poverty and Homelessness Board meetings are live broadcast. I believe this one is not today.
It looks like Metro is in the.
Oh, I see Metro. Good. Then for everybody on board, the Board of County Commissioners has appropriated funding to continually broadcast the Poverty and Homelessness Board live, and it'll be rebroadcast also on government access. So thank you for being here. Be on your best behavior, or if your best behavior is throwing pies, throw pies. Thank you. You know, a funny thing, I'm probably the only person in this room that was ever in a board meeting or any meeting of any kind when a pie got thrown. When Jim Torrey,
I remember that.
it actually wasn't a pie, it was worse, but right on the camera. Those days are over. Sorry about that. That was an interesting meeting that day in '98, I think is when that happened. So the first thing I'm going to step into is a public comment. Is anyone signed up for public comment? I know a number of folks are in the audience. Would you like to provide a direct public comment to the Poverty and Homelessness Board Executive Committee at this time? If so, raise your hand or state your name. I take that to be a no, so we'll move down the agenda. We have before us a consent agenda. And a little bit of just a bit of information before we get into voting. The executive committee is a 5-member committee that was appointed by the entire board of the Poverty and Homelessness Board. Voting today will be by a quorum of the 5 members of that committee. So when I ask for a vote, it'll be today we have 3 members of that committee present, which is Matthias Smith and Amanda Noble Flannery, who is here for American Newsman, and myself. Everybody else is here to participate. As we move down the meeting, I'm going to give the precedence to members of the committee for discussion, and then turn it over to Poverty and Homelessness Board members who are not members of the committee. There's no real space for comment from people who are not on the Poverty and Homelessness Board generally. However, I'm pretty lax with that. So if you want to say something, raise your hand, and as time permits, if you're not on the board and you're not on the executive committee, we will allow for comment and look forward to what you may have to say. So please feel free to participate. So we have before us the consent agenda, and I'm looking for a motion on the consent agenda, on the consent calendar.
I'll motion.
Moved by Matthias Smith. Do I have a second? Amanda, you're the only person that can do that.
I second.
Thank you. Moved by Mateo Smith, seconded by Amanda Noble Flannery. Discussion to the motion. I see no discussion. I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Passes 3-0 with Mayor Van Gordon and Chair Murphy absent, excused. Moving down the agenda, we have a funding update. And today we have a 5-minute update, excuse me, from James Yule on our funding information. And James, I'm not sure, are we going to talk about federal funding as well as local funding? You have the mic.
Yeah, we're going to talk both about federal funding and then state funding, and recognizing what we know today is not everything, and it's also changing at all. Seems minute by minute. So this is the information that I have updated as of a half an hour ago. So we'll start with the federal funding landscape. As some of you may know, President Trump released what folks are referring to as his skinny budget for the federal budget. I believe it was last week. This is a portion of that budget. This was shared out by another community action agency in the state of Oregon that really highlights the specific areas that are most likely to affect the work of community action work and then of our COC. So as you will see, many critical programs within our community action agency currently on a federal level are being slated to be eliminated. So CSBG, LIHEAP, CDBG, home, preschool development grants, significant reduction in funding to adult education state grants, and then C campus, which I admittedly am unfamiliar with. Highlighted here is what currently relates to our homelessness funding. And again, our team has looked at this budget and have talked with other communities, and I know Amanda has been in communication with HUD and other folks, and it remains a little unclear what exactly is intended here. But what's highlighted is a shift to ESG formula grants, and then a capping of 2 years on housing assistance. So really it's putting it kind of back on the states as far as where the funding goes. And then the 2-year cap on housing assistance, again, not fully clear what is intended there, but concerns around whether that may affect permanent supportive housing programs and funding for those programs. So, I do want to highlight, and this was mentioned yesterday in a meeting I was in with Steve Adams, who's the Lane County policy analyst. This is the first draft of the federal budget. It still has to go through the legislation process. I know, as many of you probably know that have been paying attention to the news, that there are many Republican senators who have voiced concern with these cuts. And so, fingers crossed we don't see all of these come to fruition. But it certainly is, anxiety inducing, hard to see. And we will do our best to keep you all posted as information comes out. On the state level, and this is information I just received fairly recently, have not dug into it a ton, but the state budget forecast was issued yesterday, and it did see expected to be a reduction of $755 million. That's less than what was projected. And that's largely due to the uncertainty of funding on a federal level and the state taking into account the potential losses they will see in federal funding. I do think it's important to highlight that, and this was part of the press release yesterday, is that Governor Kotek remains very focused on funding for homelessness services, education, and behavioral health. So the hope is that, although we would have wanted to see an overall increase in funding related to homelessness services, because it remains one of the governor's primary focus areas, we are hopeful that even with this forecasted reduction, we will still be able to see sufficient funding to maintain all of the state-funded programs, including All In, be able to sustain what we have created over the last several years. time will tell. It still has to go through the full legislative process, but remain hopeful. And just wanted to again note, and I know folks in this room are fully aware of just opportunities to advocate with your state representatives, local politicians, community groups, anyone that will hear and listen to you about how cuts to homelessness services and other areas that affect anti-poverty work would be really detrimental to the community. So wish I had more positive information to share. Again, still remains a lot of unknowns. I think we're going to learn, day by day as these things roll out. But that's what I know as of right now. And if there are folks on the call, I know there are many folks that are paying attention to this and are involved in spaces and conversations that I'm not a part of. So if there's anything anyone wants to add to that, please do.
Well, thanks for that update, James. It's both eye-raising and troubling, that we're not really certain exactly how things are going to shake down. And we have a number of different jurisdictions in the room today. And I'm going to look around the room to see if anybody from, we're here from Lane County, James and I and Amanda and Andrea and others online. But anybody from either any of the cities or that would like to comment on what you're seeing? Erin, I know that you're here, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but Springfield or Eugene, anything, Amanda, that you want to add to what James has said? And again, not to put you on the spot, James has said it. Go ahead.
I'll take you up on that, Pat. I was just going to say for the federal proposed budget, just clarifying that it is the federal fiscal year 26 budget, but it would affect us in fiscal year 27. So the reconciliation bill that was passed, we do have funding for CDBG for this next fiscal year starting July 1, but what's being proposed to be eliminated would be the following year.
So if I catch that correct, Erin, that gives you an opportunity to make adjustments and maybe for the lobbying that that James has mentioned to be effective. So
yeah, and if I recall when this administration was elected in 2016, they had the same proposal to fully cut the CDBG program, and in the end, it was reinstated and Congress funded it. So, there is room to move from what's being proposed to what gets adopted.
And thanks for pointing that historical event that happened, that it was slated to be cut and over the process of the lag, it did get reinstated. Amanda, I see you popped on.
Yeah, nothing more really to add than Erin, just to say that HUD did publish award amounts for the coming fiscal year, and the amounts are fairly stable, plus or minus 3% for the City of Eugene CDBG and home funds.
Well, I guess the effects are universal, and a part of the universal effect is we just don't quite know. Prepare for the worst, hope for better, and that's kind of the approach that we're taking. I wonder, James, has there been any discussion at any level on a unified statement that we as Poverty and Homelessness Board members can say that's not necessarily the official statement from the PHB, but how do we feel about it, so we can lobby with the same words? Is any talk on that yet?
I have not heard specific mention of that. I think it certainly could be valuable. I do know Steve Adams, who I mentioned, who I know you're familiar with, is very much, tuned into the activities of the PHB and the needs of the county. And I know he, is actively advocating for us. But yeah, I think there could be value in that for sure.
And, my next meeting after this is actually with Steve Adams and Vanessa Cornwall, who do our state lobbying. And I wonder if, looking around both the executive and regular PHB members, would it be valuable for us to have just a few sentences of the types of things that we see in our line of work or our section of work, that if we could have Steve and Vanessa put something together for us? Would anybody see value in that?
I think Chris has his hand
Chris? I'll look to Amanda and Matthias first.
I see value in it. Kind of hurt.
I'm not sure if Chris was voting on that or had a comment either. Just
I'm next in queue if once the board team speaks.
Chris, you're up. Go ahead.
Okay. As a local provider, we in the nonprofit sector have very limited ability to do advocacy. So we really have to make our time with electeds go far. And so our biggest concern with a joint statement, and I'm reflecting back to our original strategic plan 2016 to 2021, 3.2, which is local advocacy. We on the local level have needs that are not always, when we advocate to the state, reflected by regional leadership. So goals needed in Springfield do not necessarily reflect a regional plan. And so that said, if we do a joint statement, I hope that there's an invitation to the local providers who have not seen their goals or needs reflected in some of the items that have been submitted on our behalf. Because again, we are the ones who have to deal with it without the extra funding, or do it when there is no funding and find it through our general fund or other donations. So I do appreciate this work, and I'm very much committed to moving this forward in these hard times. I just, as a longtime representative of Springfield's population, I feel like we are underserved. And when we try and speak to our representatives, they say, well, that's not what they hear from other providers in the region who count more successes than some of the gaps.
Well, thank you, Chris. And really, one thing I'm not really talking about is a uniform and unified statement, just maybe bullet points of the types of things that we are seeing affected by the proposals for cuts.
Well, yes, sir. Direct response.
Go ahead.
I agree, but that's part of our problem, is that the bullet points are disagreed with. So if we as providers are saying that's not what your local government's saying, then we don't have as much advocacy or effectiveness ability. So I yield. Thank you.
Again, thank you for your input, Chris. Anybody else? We're a little bit over time on this issue, on this item already, but I'd love to hear more. Okay, well then I'll step forward with it, and before we do anything that is concrete, we'll get head nods from around the Poverty and Homelessness Board just for the bullet points. And it's the type of things that we're already talking about. You know, if CDBG is being cut, here are the areas that potentially could be affected very specifically. And, you know, I think if we see this kind of a response across the nation, then people will realize that it's not just dollars. Dollars represent people. Dollars represent families and people who are affected sometimes negatively. And here at Lane County, of course, we are the health department also, and we give primary care to 30,000 different individuals in our health centers. Well, that's in jeopardy at this point in time also. So different jurisdictions do, Chris, certainly have different things that are priority. 30,000 people receiving primary care is no small matter. And it's not really a part of what we do in the Poverty and Homelessness Board, but it is a part of the message. Mm-hmm. And we've got to get to the people who are who we elect to represent us at the federal level. And that we have to be a leader, I think, because our representatives at the federal level aren't necessarily in favor of these cuts. But adjacent states and states across the nation really are looking to see, you know, what does it mean? So that's how we can be of value, I believe. Thanks. I spoke too long on that. Then we'll move down the agenda without any objection on to coordinated entry, written standards. We have a follow-up by Andrea Brana. And Andrea, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, but first I'll say something that I didn't say at the classy meeting. And about 3 months ago, Andrea sat in front of the director of OHA, the director of emergency services, and the director of behavioral health for the state of Oregon, and made a tremendous presentation on what we're doing here in Lane County, talking about All In and the tremendous ability that how we are able to leverage a relatively small amount of money into great services. Andrea, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. I'm just here to provide like a pretty brief update. The last time I had come and spoke to this group, we had looked through the whole entirety of the coordinated entry written standards, and there was just a couple of requests for some updates and changes. And so one of which is on page 9 of the coordinated entry written standards, which I think is in y'all's packet. And I had just added, there was a request to be sure that somewhere in this document there was access to the definition of chronic homelessness and dedicated plus homelessness from HUD. And so there is now just a direct hyperlink to go straight to the HUD exchange to do lots of learning on the definitions of chronic homelessness and dedicated plus. And then in response to some of the data that we have gathered on our new vulnerability tool, there was a request that we translate our vulnerability tool into Spanish directly and just have that on hand. So we have done that, and it is now in the appendix at the end of this document and will be available to any assessor at any time. And then the last piece that was requested was we had dove into the inactive policy in the coordinated entry system, which outlines how and when we would exit a participant who is on the centralized wait list, who cannot be contacted based on a slew of different like curriculum around contacting them a number of times, contacting other service providers to make sure that the coordinated entry system is doing their due diligence to contact folks when they're prioritized. And so there was just an ask to look into the data a bit to see how many folks have been closed from the coordinated entry system due to being inactive, and how many of them have since returned to the coordinated entry system since they were closed for being inactive. And so when we dug in, we learned that there have only been 39 participants who have been exited for being inactive specifically since 2021. And 9 of them have since returned back to the coordinated entry list. And then of those 9, the average days between like when they were exited for being inactive and when they retouched the coordinated entry system was an average of 90 days. So not that many households who are on coordinated entry, or excuse me, on the centralized wait list have been exited for this purpose and are returning to our system. Any questions on any of those pieces?
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Can I ask a question or no?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. This is Sherry. Just a point of clarification. So my understanding is that every 6 months, folks need to be reassessed for the front door assessment. If they're not, are they closed or what happens?
That's a really great question, Sherry. Thanks for asking it. It's a separate process. It's the same thing, but it would be captured in a different way. So when folks have had their front door assessment expire after 6 months, we would exit them under a different data point to highlight that their FDA expired, not that they were prioritized. We tried to contact them and can't get in touch with them. So we would enter that data in a separate manner and be able to pull specifically these folks whose phone numbers didn't work, we couldn't reach with another provider. We checked street outreach services to try to do our best work to try to find this household before closing them and saying, we have to pull another referral for this housing provider because this household is not active in our system.
Does that cover your question, Sherry?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks, Andrea. And it looks like, Chris, is that an old hand or is your hand raised?
It's a new hand, sir. Thank you. Andrea, thank you for this report. My question to you is, how does this also reflect with like the amount of vouchers that have been awarded versus?
Thank you.
Yeah, you cut out if you said voucher, Chris.
We have 0 contact with you right now, Chris.
Hello?
Yeah.
You're back.
I was just curious, does the same ratio reflect when it comes to vouchers where people cannot be contacted and then the people return or try to return after the voucher has been removed?
I'm sorry, I'm not following the question. Is the question for folks who have been referred to a housing project specifically?
Yes, and issued a voucher after having been on the coordinated waiting list, but then for whatever reason, such as being out of contact due to fleeing domestic violence and being told that they cannot have their voucher reinstated versus being able to have their voucher reinstated. I'm just curious, are we having people able to return at the same rate or is it a little bit different skew?
I'm gonna do my best to answer your question, and if I don't, let me know. But this data point is for folks who have been prioritized for a referral to any housing project in our community through coordinated entry, and we have not been able to contact them. So when they're exited, they are just exited from the centralized wait list and would have to go back to a coordinated entry access point to be reassessed and go through that process again. The good news is that coordinated entry is not a wait list, so it doesn't necessarily mean that they're automatically going to the end of some long wait list. But if they're determined to be the most vulnerable person in our community, they would jump right back to the top and be prioritized again based on their level of vulnerability and need. I'm not sure if your question was specific to like housing choice vouchers or things throughout the housing authority, but those would be separate from this process. Does that answer?
It does. I was just curious because you did touch on that last point. I was just curious if we're finding the same kind of ratio of people lost versus returned or restored. But I'd be happy to follow up directly with you. Thank you for this data point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Looking for any more questions? I see none online, none around the room. Andrea, anything you'd like to say in summary?
I don't think so, but thank you all for looking at the written standards. I'm excited to be able to use these as our guide for policy. Thank you.
You know, I have a question, and this is a question that always comes up for me because I live in Lane County, and since 1973, I've not lived in Tillamook or any other county. This is where I live. So I'm always curious, how does ours work in comparison to other similar counties? How would you position our coordinated entry?
Sure, I'm happy to answer it, and I would actually brag about our coordinated entry system. I think that we're, I've worked in other communities in Louisiana and on the East Coast, and of both of those communities, our coordinated entry system is a bit in an advanced place with our best practices of using diversion at its core, having an active policy, using phased and dynamic prioritization. All of those pieces are national best practices, and I think are quite applauded, and folks are interested in learning more and moving in that direction.
Excellent. And as we look around the state, sometimes we find ourselves in a position because of the nature of Lane County. We're a big county, but we're not too big, and we're not too small. Mm-hmm. We're also, you know, we go all the way from the breakers to the volcanoes, and not many counties do that with a metropolitan area. So we are unique. Do we have an opportunity to provide input to other counties? Are we ever asked to help other counties with their systems?
Yeah, there are some community groups that Amanda might be able to touch on as well, but there are some continuum of cares that they're called balance of state that sort of like lump all these different rural areas in one coordinated entry system and one continuum of care. And they utilize similar things like this as well, where they would definitely have an enacted policy of folks who they can't reach because they're in rural areas or have fallen out of contact of their continuum.
And I would just add more broadly with coordinated entry. I think, you know, we were early amongst communities to adopt a replacement for the VI SPDAT. And so I know there definitely, you know, has been interest from other communities in just hearing about, you know, the assessment tool that our community created. So just piggybacking off that.
And I'm always interested if somebody else is doing something really well to see what we can do to adapt. And also if we're doing something well, can we help others to adapt or adapt what we're doing to their specific needs? Yeah. And the Association of Counties may have some questions regarding that for the upcoming conference.
Sure.
Maybe we can provide, since the conference is here, a chance to you know, give a hand up if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to share our coordinated entry system, and it's never going to be perfect, and every community would agree with you that there's always room for improvement, and so sharing amongst each other is always helpful.
Nor is it ever going to serve everybody as we wish we could serve everybody.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you, Andre. We'll move down the agenda without objection. Mateus, we okay?
Yeah.
All righty. Then the next item on the agenda today is distance performance measures. And Amanda, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. I'm going to confuse myself with two computers.
I also want to just quickly note that the slides that were included in the packet are outdated specifically for this presentation. So we will send out updated slides after. Please don't reference those as the ones for this presentation.
Okay, so again, Amanda Borda, I'm a Senior Program Services Coordinator for our Continuum of Care. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about our system performance measures, or you'll see SPMs up here. And what this is a report from our Homeless Management Information System that we're required to submit to HUD, which we just did recently. So hence the reason for kind of covering what we submitted in our most recent submission to HUD. So this report is really something that is, and our system performance measures are really baked into the Hearth Act, which really governs our continuum of care work and defines what a continuum of care is. So through that act, the government really wanted to make sure that we had a system for coordinating our homeless assistance efforts across our continuum in our community. And through that, they also wanted us to provide analysis on how we are doing on a variety of system performance measures. So not just measuring how our individual projects are performing, but how we are performing as a system as a whole and meeting the needs and addressing homelessness as a community. So really the whole concept of the continuum of care really goes along with these system performance measures and really tells HUD how are we performing as a COC, as a system. So it includes emergency shelter, transitional housing, permanent housing, and street outreach. And then we also submit, you might have heard at another meeting, our longitudinal systems analysis. So that's a different report with a slightly different purpose. And that one really looks at how households kind of move through our system and through those different program types. And so it sort of looks at how it functions for those different household types. It includes a lot of different demographics and other information. The system performance measures is not going to include all of that. It's really just looking at who's coming into these programs, who's exiting, and how we're doing on those specific measures for all persons, not households. So they're two slightly different reports that look at two different questions. So I'll just be covering the system performance measures today. It's important to note too that neither of these reports is going to include all the projects that we have in our homeless management information system. So it includes those standard program types that HUD has defined across all COCs, the ones that I've just mentioned. And the other thing to note is that this report is submitted for the federal fiscal year. So what we just submitted was for October 1, 2023 to September 30th, 2024. So we are looking back a ways and not looking necessarily at current information. So just to explain and visualize a little bit about what those project types are that are going to be pulling into this report. These are really the kind of more HUD defined program model types that we would think about in our system, and sort of when folks are unhoused versus housed by the definitions of these programs. So when we're talking about the system performance measures, it's going to include all of those in that green box, which is what pulls into our LSA. But it's also going to include that yellow, the street outreach. So that's a key difference between the two reports. The system performance measures have a number of measures that include exits from street outreach and that particular program type, which is not going to be in our LSA. So just to give you an idea of the sort of universe and scope of the report. So the system performance measures that we report on, there are a number of them. They include overall reduction in number of persons experiencing homelessness, reduction in the number of first-time homelessness, so those coming into our system for the first time, reduction in the length of time people experience homelessness, and then exits to permanent housing destinations. So to what extent are we actually exiting folks to a permanent spot outside of our system, as well as how long they're retaining that permanent housing exit. So we also look at returns to homelessness, so who has exited and then returned back to our system, as well as looking at income. And so through that, we look at both employment and non-employment, so benefits, cash benefits, for example. So all of these really contribute to the concept of making sure that homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. As you can see, they really correlate to sort of that concept of that we've heard nationally of just wanting to make sure that homelessness, when it does occur, is rare, is brief, and does not happen multiple times. So just a warning, this is going to be a lot of data, and typically our lovely HMIS lead, Carly Walker, would kind of be with me to cover a lot of this information. And so she is still out on leave. And if we have more detailed questions about sort of the data and the universe and all of the ins and outs of those pieces, I'm happy to jot down those questions, but I probably won't be able to answer from a data perspective today. I'll do my best with the information I have, but I'm happy to note any questions, or if we want to know more about a specific number that is in here, I can certainly make a note of those questions. So just wanted to give that caveat. So the first measure we have is length of time persons remain homeless. So this metric is looking at current homelessness episode. And again, that's going to be different in how they look at that in the LSA. So you can see here that in general, folks are staying homeless longer. Our episodes are increasing. You can see previously the first line has the average length of time for people in emergency shelter and transitional housing. So it's just looking at those that are not permanent housing destinations. You can see that we had a little bit of a downward trend there from 158, 110 to 97, and now we're sort of going back up where that episode of homelessness is getting a little bit longer as we get into that 2024. The second line there also includes permanent housing, and so it includes that time that someone is in permanent housing prior to housing move-in. And since we generally serve folks who are chronically homeless in those programs, they're going to have pretty long average lengths of homelessness. So you can see that's why that number is significantly higher than that top line. Either way, what we're seeing here is that folks are staying homeless longer over that previous year. So some of the things we also like to talk about some of the kind of strategies that we implement that impact these system performance measures. So that's something we talk about in our continuum of care application each year. What are we doing to impact these measures and improve on them from year to year? So some of the things that we have implemented are staff positions within Lane County who work with individuals on that central wait list to really expedite that movement and make it as quick as possible, especially once folks are prioritized. We've also really significantly expanded our diversion resources to make sure that, right, those folks that are coming in, if they're able to be connected to something quickly with minimal effort, we're able to do that, really reducing that time that folks spend in our system. We've also implemented housing navigator and landlord liaison positions to secure those housing pathways, make sure we have folks who are really intentional about connecting to the kind of market of units that we have out in the community and securing those partnerships. We had previously been doing a process of weighting the score on our central wait list based on length of time homelessness. That is something that we revised when we implemented our new assessment tool and sort of made some changes to coordinate entry. So it's something to consider as we sort of see this trend of that length of time going up. Might want to revisit if that continues. Maybe we re-implement something like that or take a look at the data and see what's happening with our central waitlist and how we're prioritizing. So those are just things as we're making these policy changes, we want to make sure we're looking at what the impact might be. And it could have nothing to do with that. So it's just something we'll want to analyze further. Obviously, a lack of units and housing in general in our community remains a challenge in getting folks quickly into housing. It's just going to take time, right, when there isn't enough units readily available and that connection is not readily available. There also is, I think, a lack of sufficient move-on options that really limits the flow through our system. So you'll see in some of these other measures, we're seeing less folks and they're staying longer in our system, and there's just not enough of that flow happening, the outflow to get folks moving on. And so something else to consider. Returns to homelessness here, which looks at how many folks are coming back to our system after they've exited to a permanent destination in the 2 years prior to this report year. So those folks in this universe would have had to have exited within that 2-year period prior to 2023 October. So looking far back, who are those folks that exited to permanent destinations as HUD defines them? So that really means exiting to a subsidy program or exiting to a permanent destination without a subsidy. So living on their own or owning, as well as staying with family or friends if it's a permanent exit. It's essentially if we don't expect them to come back to our system. So any folks that exited to those destinations as HUD defines them and then have since shown up in our system. And so I think what's important to note here is these have remained, as you can see, pretty consistent. These aren't typically fluctuating quite a bit. We have a fairly low amount of returns. It's important, I think, to look at this one sort of on the flip side and seeing that, right, we have a total returns of 24%, but that means, right, that 76% of folks did not return to our system. So the overwhelming majority in all of these who are exiting from all of these different types are staying permanently housed. But there is that percentage that do come back. And so But it does remain fairly consistent and not too high. And we would expect probably a little bit higher, obviously, from street outreach to return versus permanent housing. So again, those are identified when someone shows back up in our system and is homeless at an entry point. So I think some of the things we've really done are pretty heavy investments in prevention and diversion. In terms of retention, we've also talked about case conferencing and lateral transfers, making sure we're exploring all options for folks, as well as eviction prevention and tenancy support. So I think making sure we're preventing all those exits to non-permanent destinations is part of that equation as well. The next one is number of persons experiencing sheltered homelessness in HMIS. So this just looks at the number of people we have in emergency shelter and transitional housing. It's not going to be the same as our PIT, our point in time sheltered count, because this is covering a whole report year versus point in time, which is one specific night. So they're not going to be the same number. And this is going to be a little more accurate in terms of who is sheltered in our system. Let's see.
Amanda, are you okay with questions as we go along, or would you rather group it at the end?
You all think to.
Okay, so
Is there a question?
I don't have a visual on hands raised, so if you want to ask a question, just insert your name and I'll give you the mic for the question. Okay.
There were a couple comments that I didn't see, but I don't know if they were questions or not.
Nothing right.
Okay, nothing at this point. Actually, I have a question. It's kind of along the lines of, and you don't need to answer this directly right now, but maybe weave it in. If somebody is disqualified from housing, do we keep track of people who are disqualified who didn't leave by their own choice? Somebody who's kicked out.
Say more about disqualified.
Yeah. They get kicked out for whatever reason.
Like exited from a permanent supportive housing program?
Yes.
And then what would, sorry, what would you
do we keep track of what happens to those individuals after that, or do we kind of leave that alone?
It would depend. So sometimes when folks exit a permanent supportive housing program for a variety of reasons, they get evicted or they have issue, whatever it might be, they may end up, it doesn't necessarily disqualify them from other programs. And so they may end up doing a front door assessment, getting reconnected. They may end up transferring to another program that's a better fit for them. Or we don't necessarily do those sort of calls of follow-ups necessarily, but we would see in our system, have they shown up elsewhere? Mm-hmm. They may then enter a shelter. They may enter some other program type, an alternative shelter. So there are a variety of touch points where they may reconnect. But it really would vary based on the individual circumstances, how they come back through our system.
So it's by name, so we track people by name. And I guess the question is, if somebody is evicted from a program, do they get directed, do we know, to a front door reassessment, or do we let them try to find that?
So I can tell you from the continuum side of things, the continuum of care programs are required at when you are exiting someone, because we follow a housing first approach. Yeah. They're required to follow their termination policy, which has to include multiple steps before someone's exited. Very minimal reasons are allowed for an exit. It has to be in the most extreme circumstances where they're really unable to serve this person, or they have violence, things like that, where it's really gotten to that point. And they are required to explore additional steps to prevent someone from exiting to a homeless destination. So those are all should be part of everyone's, and we verify that are part of everyone's policy at exit. So it should not just be a see you later in those programs.
Because quite often those people are the people with the greatest needs. Mm-hmm. Very good. That answers my question. Thank you.
Okay.
There were a couple.
There were questions?
I'm not sure. There were if you scroll up, is it comments popped up, but I wasn't sure if they were actually.
I asked a question. I just asked after the data dump.
You have to bring the mouse all the way to the top. Mm-hmm.
I think so. We're asking about data unaffectedness of co-occurring access. I think that's something for our data team would have to answer, and I don't have that information on that here today, so we can follow up on that question later.
We'll make note of that question, Chris. Thank you.
I think that was it.
Thanks, Amanda.
I'll keep that open just so I can see questions. So on this sheltered homelessness one, I want to point out that you see that little uptick in 2023. That's really due to added all-in beds and additional shelter capacity. And so then you're going to see a little bit of a decrease there in 2024. But I think what's important here is what we see on the back end is that, again, folks are staying longer and the universe of people for this has decreased. And so we're seeing folks, less people for longer periods of time in shelter in general is what we're seeing across these measures. So overall, we want to obviously a reduction of people experiencing homelessness. That is a goal overall of our system and of our continuum of care. Overall shelter stays in general, we would hope would be brief and really housing focused, but a lack of housing pathways obviously makes shelter stays longer. And we're really seeing that that's increasing our length of time people experience homelessness. So just some important things to note about that shelter one. The next one is employment and income growth. You can see these have also stayed fairly consistent across the years. And we're seeing not too much of a difference. We did see a good increase over 2023 to 2024 for folks who have exited. So the top line looks at those who are still enrolled in a project, have not exited, and what that income changes for total income versus the bottom, which looks at those who have exited and how that income has changed from beginning to end there. There are a bunch of sub-measures under this metric that look at employment versus cash benefit income for both stayers and leavers. So we didn't include all of those details here, but in general, we're seeing good increases and good numbers here in terms of increases of income. So I think what we're really seeing is employment obviously remains a challenge for those that have significant barriers like disabilities, criminal history, lack of job skills. So that's going to continue to be a challenge in how we get those folks connected. WorkSource Lane, obviously, there are a number of programs and resources that they provide, and we do our best to make sure folks are getting connected there to what they offer. They've done a lot around job development and employer outreach, especially over the last several years. And we've really done a great job of integrating and co-locating some of the housing and employment resources. And we've been, over the last several years, much more intentional about that with some of the all-in work and really just baking that in so that it's not just a referral to WorkSource Lane or into employment services. It's really part of the program itself. We also have funding really embedded at WorkSource for housing in the past. So making sure that those things are co-located and that there's that direct connection between employment and housing. I also think we have obviously additional opportunities for increased collaboration, maybe with the Eugene Chamber and other partners who are now much more active at the table. And that could be, the next area to explore of how we really connect with the business community to increase employment. The next one is first-time homeless, or the number of new persons in emergency shelter and transitional housing. This one, let's see here. This one is a bit misleading because what HUD is really wanting to look at here is first-time homelessness. But what we're really looking at is the number of people who are coming into these project types for the first time. So not quite the same thing as thinking of folks who are homeless for the first time. So this one is a bit misleading if you're thinking about who's coming in. Some of these folks, especially because we have programs that were maybe alternative shelter previously classified and are now made improvements and are now emergency shelter, might begin pulling into this report, but they could have been in those programs for years. So that's one instance where it would not make sense. Also, not everyone accesses shelter or transitional housing, but could have been homeless previously, right? So this just really is going to identify folks that come into a shelter for the first time, and sort of the way it's measured might make the assumption that everyone who is homeless immediately goes into a shelter, which we know is not quite the path, right? So keeping that in mind, we are seeing fewer persons. You see that uptick again, persons served. That's going to be that spike because of the shelters that we have available. The numbers really going to contribute to that. And then it'll show the number who did not have entries in these projects in the previous 2 years. I think what's more important in and our inflow every month, and is going to give you a more accurate picture of that, because that's going to tell you by name who we're seeing for the first time, not just in the shelter or transitional housing programs. And we do have a high number of newly homeless. Over 600 individuals in March were added to our homeless by name list, and 46% of those had not been on that list before. And you can see that trend is sort of consistent in February, January, December, November, those previous months. We have a significant number who are new to the list, and about half each time are for the first time on that list. So at least several hundred folks each month are new and have not been seen before. So I think we need additional targeted assistance to really address those at-risk populations before they come to our system, reviewing those risk factors of income level, folks who are accessing other mainstream benefit access, like utility assistance or other things, so we can really better intercept at those previous points before they get to that point. And then increasing, obviously, resources for prevention, diversion, eviction prevention is critical. We had a big uptick of that during COVID, and a lot of that has leveled out. And so advocating for increased resources there. And then we have successful placement and housing retention. And so this one is looking at to what extent are we placing folks into those permanent destinations at exit, and how much are they staying in those permanent supportive housing programs. So retention in those programs. And so looking at a couple of different things. The first one there is going to look at exits from street outreach directly to a permanent destination. And the second line there is going to be exits from emergency shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing, and the percentage of people who exit to a permanent destination. So you can see these numbers are really low. We would love to see these be increased. And you can see over the years, we've kind of had a little bit of fluctuation. Our street outreach number has decreased, although we do have the universe of folks is increasing. For the number of people we're exiting from street outreach has increased significantly, but also the returns have increased as well. And then for the second one, it sort of lumps together these three very different program types. And so I did have us look a little bit further into this. It's important to note that the emergency shelter one does include both night by night, EGAN, other warming shelters, as well as entry-exit shelters that see people consistently. The exit rate for those in general to permanent destinations is 17% versus rapid rehousing, which is closer to 78%. And transitional housing is closer to 50%. So the emergency shelter exits are going to be the highest number of exits, the biggest part of this universe, and have the lowest exits. So they're heavily contributing to this outcome here. And then you can see in the bottom that our retention, once folks are in permanent supportive housing, that's retaining it for 12 months or longer, is pretty consistent. I'm going to pause there and see if there was a question. So Sherry, question about 2023 seems to be an outlier, and that's all-in funding. Yes, so we had a significant increase in shelter capacity because of all-in funding, and so that's going to affect a number of these measures because it just increases the universe of folks.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this number too, like successful placement and how we're wanting that to go up. And I'm just looking at 2023, it actually went down a little bit. I was just wondering if having that money is actually tied to permanent housing. Like having that money, is that creating a situation where people are more successful with permanent housing?
Yeah, so I think the all-in funding has certainly had an impact. We have our all-in dashboards that really give you a better picture of sort of the direct impact of those funds on permanent exits. This is really going to pull in a much broader universe of not just the all-in, but our other programs as well. So it's a little bit difficult to look at specifically the contribution of that. But I think if you want to know more about the impact of the all-in funding on permanent exits, you can see that in that specific dashboard. But I think what's important is that, right, we have significant exits. The numbers are good in terms of exits, but we also have, right, that inflow. And so it's kind of the full system. As we exit folks, we also have a significant number coming in. So. So I talked a lot about these things already. I think what's really needed in our exits to permanent housing, again, more housing pathways can increase our ability to exit people, right, to permanent destinations. So we need to do that, as well as increase our housing focus and shelter, because we have a significant number of people who are really just accessing shelter in our community, but a very low percentage of those are going to exit to a permanent destination. So as much as we can increase that housing focus in our shelter programs will impact this measure. And I think just more data analysis could be helpful on our exits to permanent destinations in general, so that we can know more about, right, ask those questions about who is exiting, who's not, to permanent destinations, so we can analyze that further and figure out what strategies might help exit more folks and what's not working for people. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much the whole presentation that I have. Again, if there are a lot more data specific questions in terms of who's pulling into this, who's not, we can jot those down and bring that to our data team. They're going to be much better at answering that. Chris had a question about folks that exit to the other sort of neutral destinations. Again, this report is specific to HUD, and so they look at the destinations that they consider to be successful, or what they consider to be a permanent destination. So locally, we might have a different definition of what might be successful, and it's certainly not going to be how an individual defines success. So I think that's why I give the caveat that the report obviously is limited to what HUD wants to look at and analyze, and not necessarily us. And so we can always look at our local dashboards. We can look at different destinations and how we see that. But when it comes to our HUD funding, this is how HUD would define success. So.
Mrs. Borda, Mr. Chair, may I do a direct response?
Sure, go ahead.
The reason why I'm asking Mrs. Borda is with the neutral standpoint, some of our local electeds get confused when they see our data points and they go, well, we're doing really a lot of success. But then they ask, why does this person who's on hospice not have a place to go? Why is this not being counted? Because you don't get
wires. And the response from HUD is this is the data we provide them in order to get the funding that they provide on an ongoing basis. Now, you mentioned our dashboards, which do keep more close local track of success and the ratios of our performance ratios. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, well, we have so I linked them here. I think those just give, right, each report is going to give you a different list, I think is a really good one, again, to see more demographics, who's coming into our system each month, what that looks like. This report, again, is not going to have any of those details. It's just looking at the big picture, who's coming in, who's exiting. It's not going to look at the different types of households, and has a little bit different definitions than we have. And so if you want to look at those, that might give you a better picture. And then if there are more questions, of course, our data team is amazing, and they can always come up with really more specific reports to specific questions if we need to do that locally.
Thank you, Chris. Then without objection, we'll move down the agenda. Amanda, a lot of data, tons of stuff. You'll take written questions and as we move forward, bearing in mind that a lot of the data we keep doesn't sometimes feel exactly what we're the picture of what we're doing locally, but when we put that in conjunction with some of the other data that we're tracking on our websites and in the dashboards, it becomes a little bit more on the ground for Lane County.
Yeah, I think what's important is not just looking at one report, right? We have the SPMs, we have the LSA, we have our PIC count, we have our homeless find. So it's really looking at a combination of these, and our full HMIS is really robust. So we have a lot more data than some continuums. And I think it's just looking at that bigger picture and answering those questions locally.
And the dashboards are all really quite user friendly as far as identifying trends and actual data from Lane County, or from the cities in the county. Well, thanks, Amanda. We'll move down the agenda. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for listening and participating. Next item on the agenda is the strategic planning. And I'm afraid we're running a little bit late, long on the agenda right now, James, so probably a little bit less time than 20 minutes for this.
Yeah, I'll go through it a little quickly. And these slides are in the packet, so please dig into them if you haven't already. And just to give some context, and I know this isn't news to most folks here, just where we're at in the process. We have shared out with you all a draft of the strategic plan. The most recent draft was included in Diana's email, a link to it. And we are in the process now of determining, prior to the vote at next month's PHB meeting, a vote to approve the strategic plan. We're also looking to vote on what we want to prioritize within the work plan for the first year of the plan. And so these are the results that we received through both the drop-in open house event that was at the fairgrounds, as well as the QR code survey that was sent out, targeted to members of the PHB, the subcommittees, and specifically to League, the lived experience group. As of now, we have 36 responses. We did also share information and the QR about the plan and the QR code at the Classy event that was held last week, which was aimed at HMIS users. And so we may get some input from there as well. Again, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because of time, but if you remember from the plan, the draft plan, there were 4 core areas that were proposed for us to work on through the duration of the plan. Through this surveying around prioritization, these 2 had the highest responses. So at the highest response, with 47% of respondents picking this as a top prioritization area, shelter and housing sustainability and advocacy, and then coming in second was poverty and unsheltered homelessness crisis response system. And again, just want to highlight, this is what respondents are suggesting we prioritize for working on in the first year of the plan. It's not that these other core areas won't also be worked on after prioritizing these areas. So as we dig deeper into these areas, so when looking at the core area of shelter and housing sustainability and advocacy strategies, 45% of respondents wanted to prioritize advocating for income-based housing and innovative housing solutions countywide. I also will note, and this is not news to anyone who has reviewed the strategic plan, but very wordy, and so it's hard to fit a lot of this into slides. Amanda actually earlier this week had an excellent idea for a one-pager, and so we'll work to develop a one-pager after we kind of move through the process of looking at all of these, because I know it's a lot of information. So the strategy that was picked by respondents as them seeing as one that we should prioritize under shelter and housing sustainability and advocacy, under the subheading of advocating for income-based housing and innovative housing solutions countywide, was this strategy number 7, advocate for local and statewide efforts to prioritize affordable housing and center attention on the needs of the extremely low income and homeless households across Lane County. Moving on, and this is an especially ugly slide, I apologize. Under the shelter and housing sustainability advocacy, these are the sub-strategies that were prioritized by respondents. And you'll see here in parentheses, this is where they tie into those areas and where they may fit into the larger system. And we're eventually going to get into talking about the ad hoc groups and the committees that will work on these areas. We will maintain, the required committees that we have as a part of our responsibilities as a COC board. But depending on the priorities that the board decides to move forward with in the plan, we likely will see new subcommittees created that will specifically be working on these plans. So just keeping that in mind as we talk through this. And again, I'm talking too much, so I'm going to go a little bit quick here. Looking under the core area of poverty and unsheltered homelessness crisis response system strategies, 46% of folks picked to prioritize transforming the unsheltered homelessness and encampment response. when you look at specific strategies under that heading, the two that were picked to prioritize were working with first responders and law enforcement to reduce practices that penalize people for experiencing homelessness. And then 10, which was work with local officials and people with lived experience to engage with community groups in order to identify agreed upon spaces that will be safe, accessible, and available to people experiencing vehicular homelessness and supported by the local community. The words in that one. And again, I'm not going to go through each of these strategies, but it again maps out in more detail the items that would be added to work plans to be worked on if these are end up being prioritized. So I think the key pieces until we get to a more digestible one-pager are really just recognizing that the survey responses have prioritized these two core areas for the first year of work under the strategic plan. And then within those headings have identified these more specific strategies for moving forward. So, like I said, we'll be looking to get a vote of approval for the draft strategic plan at next month's full meeting. And along with that will be, these strategies included for the first year. And then once the plan has been approved, we'll look to July to start to identify the committees that will work on each of these strategies for the plans. There was a slide included in the packet with some proposed committees. I left that out of this presentation because I think it's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. I think that, we need to have these conversations first. The board needs to approve the plan, needs to decide what prioritization we're going with. And then once that's done and we move into July and August, we can revamp, if needed, the committee structure. So I'll stop talking, open to hearing input, feedback, discussion. For input, Julie's application.
Okay, I'll look around the room and online for questions or comments. A lot of the information there, James, and yes. the draft plan, which I have a hard copy in my hand, this has been sent out to Poverty and Homelessness Board members, and it's accessible to everybody.
Yeah, it was included in Diana's email that went out with the materials for this meeting. Yep.
And so I have mine downloaded into files in my computer. Bear in mind this is the draft, and so the next step on this is at the Poverty and Homelessness Board, the general meeting in June.
Yes. Yeah, we will be looking for the board to vote to approve this strategic plan. And I have emailed members individually too. I'm happy to chat with any members that have, I recognize in these meetings, especially when things like this are getting rushed, that there may not be time for each member to fully digest what's in the plan. So I'm happy to set up time with folks to chat through any questions or concerns that they have in advance of that vote. So yeah, just reach out. And Chris, I'm trying, can you reword that question a little bit? I'm having a hard time understanding what.
So just going off of your recommendations, if we're looking at number 2 and number 1 of the 4 areas of support, knowing that we are trying to set policy for not only the next year, but the future of what we're doing, is there like Cottage Grove or Springfield have different strategies in the city of Eugene? So dealing with the poverty and unsheltered homelessness response differs for those different areas. And the recommendations that non-service providers, because people who live in a community but don't serve the direct population, they have a different set of input and goals, such as don't be sleeping on my doorstep, as said by our local chamber, who also participated. It's a great group, really moving on, trying to help support us. I was just curious, with these basic recommendations, as y'all were doing a deeper dive as you made this survey, was it considered, how is this going to be spread or represented? Because asking us to vote on something that's a generalized cookie cutter approach won't help us if the needs of the people who deal with the people who don't fit in whatever plan offsets our next steps as we roll out implementation. I'm willing to follow up with you directly and maybe make a more cohesive statement for when we do the vote, because I plan to speak on this then.
And in the interest of time, James, let's go ahead and do that and ask Chris to follow up directly with you.
I do want to clarify one thing, though.
Yeah.
You mentioned first, Chris, you said my recommendations. To be clear, these are not my recommendations. These are not Lane County's recommendations. These are the results of the surveying of PHB members, committee members, league, et cetera. So I just want to make that distinction. And I hear you, Chris, and that makes sense to me. So that, and we can definitely follow up. I would also just, for context, I think these are the very broad umbrella areas that we're then going to get in the weeds on through the committees that will be created. And that's where like the nuances in communities and municipalities, that's where I see those things being addressed. It's not necessarily going to be named in the broader umbrella pieces of the plan. But again, Chris, happy to chat with you offline in more detail about that too.
And along those lines, James, a strategic plan generally has broad areas. Tactics are where you get into what is happening specifically on the ground. What are the boots on the ground doing to implement the strategies that we've all, that through months of work, we've got to this point.
Yeah.
Months of work with a lot of different methods. Great. Then, Chris, I'll look forward to hearing whatever you have. You said a more cohesive statement for the Poverty and Homelessness Board, the general meeting in May, in June, as we move toward that. Thank you. Any further questions, comments on the strategic plan? If not, we'll move down toward the end of the agenda. We'll try and adjourn on time today. Some of us are going over to the Lane County Budget Committee meeting, which starts in 9 minutes. So then moving down, jurisdictional updates. We've kind of had Lane County's jurisdictional update through the reports. Anything that needs to be added for Lane County? I personally have nothing other than, and Amanda, you've been attending board meeting, providing general input. As we move forward, one thing that the Board of County Commissioners is particularly particularly strong on is the sanctuary statement that we've made, and in particular, making certain that some of the more vulnerable and members of our community are receiving medications necessary that otherwise may be restricted by federal regulations. There's a lot more on that, a lot more to be said about it, a lot more to be heard about it, and much of that you can find online. But if you have any questions on that, please feel free to direct them toward me personally. Okay, then we'll look at City of Eugene. And Amanda, you're here from the City of Eugene, or anyone from the City of Eugene, anything, any jurisdictional update?
I do have a couple items. I'll make it very quick. I heard you have a meeting soon, so.
I can be late.
Okay. Several city-funded affordable housing projects appear to be on the brink of getting state funds from OHCS, and that would be an additional 139 units newly constructed, probably start construction in the next year. So we're hopefully waiting on that. And then earlier this month, the city sponsored a trauma-informed and healing-centered property management training, which was a success with nearly 100 attendees. And we do have an upcoming city-sponsored training on fair housing rights for LGBTQIA+ folks. And that's June 5th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. It's a virtual opportunity that will be on Zoom. And details are in the weekly community announcements email that Diana sent this morning. And then you may have seen some recent media about the great collaboration between the city, eWeb, and Nightingale hosted shelters that brought water, electric, and sewer infrastructure to the shelter site at 34th and Hilliard. And we're very appreciative of our partners and that opportunity to make that site better. Thank you.
Well, boy, you said that all very quickly, Amanda. A lot to digest there. City of Eugene is, as always, very proactive in its in strategies and implementation. So, and we would love to invite you back sometime to help us all to understand some of the things that Eugene is very actively moving forward on. That could be an item for a future Poverty and Homelessness Board meeting, if you're willing to do that.
Sure, yes. Depending on the topic, we'll get the right staff but I'll come too.
Thank you. Then we'll move along to the City of Springfield. And Erin, you are here. Anybody else from the City of Springfield?
Looks like Mayor's here.
Oh, and Mayor Van Gordon, good to see you.
Well, I apologize for being late. I snuck in a little bit late. Just a couple brief updates. We completed the Desserts for Dinner fundraiser for Catholic Community Services, which supports that homeless project in downtown or in the middle part of Springfield called Oasis, was completed over the weekend. I don't know how much it raised yet, but it is anytime you hand out desserts is a very popular event. The Home Consortium met and we approved funding for the home applications in Springfield, which should help with additional housing units. And we talked about the 2025 home RRP, that is RFP that is going to come out later this year. So that's all good news too. And then it is May. So we've been back from United Front for probably a month now. One of the big lobbying conversations we had in United Front was just really around that CDBG question, right? Making sure that, CDBG is important, we need it, but also asking for more flexibility because, service providers and their needs, vary widely, and having more flexibility in that funding source is going to help everybody.
Thank you, Mayor Van Gordon. I see thumbs up from a number of participants today. Other communities, I know that Mike Fleck is here from Cottage Grove. Anybody else from other communities with updates?
Don't really have much to update from Cottage Grove. Thank you, though.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Good to hear your voice. And we'll move down to...
In Florence, I know we're working on an affordable housing project that will also include a daycare center for people that are working in Florence.
Excellent. And then Maggie, down in Florence also, the community outreach has just moved into a new facility. Is that correct?
I hadn't heard about that. Okay. Oh, you mean Siusla Outreach? They'll be moving in next month.
Mm-hmm. That is a big deal. So
it's wonderful. So I'll have more to report next month on that.
Perfect. Thank you. Anything else from communities around the county, from breakers to volcanoes? Okay, then we'll look to next month's meeting. Next month is the meeting is June 26th, is that right?
Yeah, just note that's a change. It's a move to the fourth Thursday because of the Juneteenth holiday. So
okay. And so far for the next for the agenda for next month, we will be voting to approve the strategic plan, and there'll be a discussion surrounding that. Anything else that anybody can recommend or hope for on the next agenda?
We also likely will have the point in time count results information to discuss.
Excellent.
We'll also have a COC debriefing of we just received our COC score from the previous competition, so I can give a quick update.
And can we hope for and expect what is the most recent update on funding issues?
Yeah, I think we'll just leave a standing funding update agenda item, and yeah, likely some more pieces will be in place by June.
And from the different jurisdictions, be prepared for that. If you're seeing things that are specifically affecting work that we would not necessarily talk about at this meeting, please feel free to bring that up, because it's important that we all understand the impacts to the people that we serve of the funding issues that are very dynamic and changing on an hourly, even sometimes, basis.
Definitely. Yep.
Excellent. With that, we'll move toward adjournment. Anything else for the good of today's agenda? I see nothing. Thanks all for being here. This room is large, and if you can make it next month, look that's at Harris Hall.
Next month will be
for the regular board meeting. Then look forward to seeing people in person if you can be there. Otherwise, look forward to hearing your voice and visiting you in your hometown, Maggie, sometime very, very soon. All right. With that, we are adjourned.
Thank you. Bye.